First, I want to thank you for joining us on such a beautiful day. We've already been talking about how nice it is outside, so I'm sure you would like to be outside enjoying the weather. But I do appreciate you joining for this conversation today about equity-minded policy analysis. As Ms. Connolly was saying, we really want to talk about how we can, in our roles, as we look at policy, as we approve things, think about equity and whether the work that we're doing really will impact positively the equity agenda in Virginia. And so today, generally, I'll be joined with Tom Allison, so pleased to have him presenting with me this afternoon. We're going to walk through this presentation. We do want this to be engaging, so since we're stuck inside, we might as well enjoy it and be together and engage. And so really, if you have a question while we're moving along, feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, or if you want to use the Q&A to put something in the chat, we'll try to check that as we go along. But again, stop us and pause us. We want this to be as much fun as being inside today can be. Generally today, we're going to be talking about equity in general, what equity is in Virginia and in higher education, so we can all be operating from the same framework and understanding and some common understanding about what equity looks like in Virginia. We're going to identify some opportunities for equity-based analysis. How can we, in our roles as an agency and as the council, apply equity-minded policy analysis so we can have more equitable outcomes? And specifically, where we'll spend most of our time today is on reviewing and discussing 6 questions that we've kind of come up with that you can use, that we can use as we review policy to see if it's more likely that we'll have more equitable outcomes. And then lastly, reflect on that. Just have a discussion at the end about how we can apply this work in our work here at SCHEV and on the council, but also in our daily lives. Any question before we get started? Great. We'll start with just talking about specifically what equity is. I was in a meeting last week and former Secretary of Education, Jim Dyke, was talking about equity and equality, and he referred to it as equality is when you give everyone a pair of shoes to run the race. Equity is when you give everyone the right size shoe to run the race. And so that's kind of just a slight difference of what equity and equality is. But equity is really talking about creating those opportunities for greater access to be in that race, this race called life, and then giving the person the appropriate resources so they can be the best that they can be, or their organization the best resources. So it's allocating resources, providing greater access, and then addressing any existing imbalances. So we know there are imbalances in education. If you look at some of our, in the past, we know that historically, different individuals and groups have had less access to higher education in Virginia. Specifically, some are here listed here, but you'll see more in the next data sheet of other groups that have and where they fall on the along the lines in terms of post-secondary enrollment. So, but we know this to be true. And while we know in the past, laws were a lot more overt, and we had in our laws and sanctions that did not permit equal engagement in education, now it's a lot more nuanced. And so it does require us to be more thoughtful about the policies and practices that we have to ensure that we are not further exacerbating some of the issues that were caused in the past. So, Tom?
Great, thank you, Paula, and Madam Chair, members of the committee. I think it's always a good place to start framing some of those imbalances that Paula mentioned by looking at just the access rates of who is going to college in Virginia. So this is actually a chart that the council should be familiar with when we think about the 25,000 high school graduates in Virginia that graduate Virginia high schools, but don't show up in some sort of post-secondary education program. But here we've added just a few more demographics just to show the imbalances of who is showing up in our institutions. So just to skip to the green bar at the bottom, we've got about 71% on any given year of our high school graduates enroll in college somewhere in America. And virtually every other group besides white and Asian students are doing that at a much lower rate. So the top third, looking at some of the demographics, students with disabilities is about 50%, economically disadvantaged 56%, and limited English proficiency also around 60%. So we also know that by geography this varies a lot as well, with many of our rural areas having lower post-secondary enrollment rates. Moving along, you also see just by race and ethnicity, with Native Hawaiian, American Indian, Hispanic, and Black and African American students enrolling at lower rates. So this is in many ways where we start. This is kind of the leading indicator for what ends up being graduation rates, attainment rates statewide, and also some of the economic disparities that we end up seeing in the workforce later on. So in a lot of ways, this is this data and this observation is a starting point for how a lot of our policy and budget decisions need to keep equity in mind and need to keep the starting point in mind. So, of course, I mentioned that the council should be pretty familiar with that idea and with this idea of equity, because we just went through this process with the Virginia plan and renewing our goals and our vision for the Virginia plan for higher education. There's lots of details we could go over for that, but I don't want to be too repetitive from that process we just had. But even just looking at the vision statement, for us wanting to be the best educated state by 2030, which is really just a function of the numerator being how many folks have a college degree, the denominator being the Virginia population, that's 70%. That is how we were interpreting the best educated state. But I think throughout the Virginia plan process, we really questioned, okay, well, best for whom? Who are we serving? Let's think about that starting point. And how not everyone's starting from the same place, and that's sort of how we ended up with our the new goals of our Virginia plan, as well as the vision statement of being the best state for education and making sure that equity is incorporated there. Paula, over to you.
As Tom was just saying, the new plan now has the goals of being equitable, affordable, and transformative. We're looking for not only transformation for students who participate in our higher ed system, but also we have learned this past year that we really need to consider how we might want to transform higher education to make sure that it is having the impact on all students that that's set up to do. And so with that transformation, it's not just about the change, it's about thoughtful change, really thinking about how we can make a difference. And I think that we have now an opportunity, now having gone through 2020, a year of change, to really make transformation in the years to come, to take what we learned and how we pivoted so quickly in 2020 to be able to work from home completely. Businesses and restaurants, now they have to-go opportunities, or they created outdoor seating. They really thought thoughtfully about how we can still do our work and do it better and make sure that we continue to serve everyone. And so that's where we can think about how apply the same to higher education. What can we learn from this last year and transform education so we can continue to move forward with this new awareness of how there are many imbalances and make it more balanced for more people. So that thoughtful transformation is going to occur from asking new questions, from approaching old things in a new way. We know the risks ahead if we don't. We've heard the term lost generation in the past. We're hearing it again with the class of 2020. And those students who are now in school virtually being considered a lost generation. We heard that in the past as it related to massive resistance and students not being able to go to school. And so these terms are not new to us, but we can react differently and ensure that as we move forward, we do create more equity within our system. So in that, we started looking to see what resources were out there that could help us. And so we found a protocol for assessing equity mindedness in state policy. And this is done by the very reputable organization, Center for Urban Education at the University of Southern California. And they were actually the ones who coined the phrase equity mindedness. And it speaks to the ability for individuals to identify and address inequities in policies and in practices. And there's a second piece of this. It also talks about the practitioner taking the time to also be thoughtful and consider their own biases and sorry. Apparently someone at my front door. There's reflecting on their own biases and assumptions, and making sure that they do not, kind of influence the policies that they're working on with their own biases. So with that, in the protocol, they identify 6 indicators that you should consider when you're looking at policy to have more equity-minded policy. And what we did, we took those and reframed them into actually 6 questions. But the 6 indicators speak to how how a policy is approached or addressed. It looks at language, it looks at data, it looks at impact, consistency, and then how that policy is framed. we took these 6 indicators and took them into questions so we can see how we can apply them in the work that we do every day as a council or as an agency. Any questions before we move forward? Feel free to unmute and use Q&A. If not, we're going to go ahead and get into these questions. Tom, you got the first one for me?
Paula, I'm sorry. This is Stephen Moore. I do have a question.
Yes.
How do we think about, obviously there's a lot that higher education needs to do in this area. How do we think about the gaps that exist, essentially as students are completing high school? Is the idea that we would essentially try to close those gaps fully with what higher education itself is able to do, or is there some kind of, I guess, collaborative or coordinated effort with, pre-K through 12 efforts to sort of ensure that the outcomes in total get to where we're trying to go? Does that question make sense?
Absolutely, and I think, and you already kind of answered it yourself, is with the collaboration with K-12. There's no way that we can make these changes without working with K-12 and kind of ensuring that students are being prepared to be more successful. We learned a lot this year, and actually a lot of what we learned this year has forged a lot stronger relationships with VDOE, with SCHEV. And so we've been doing a lot more collaboration in terms of holding trainings, sharing information and resources. And so that has started, but that's definitely one of the first steps. We definitely couldn't do this on our own. We have to work with students before they get here.
And I guess what that leads to, at least to me in terms of in practice, is when we think about measuring things, somehow being able to unpack like what is I guess kind of a pre-existing equity issue versus an equity issue created or at least not sufficiently addressed by higher ed itself. It seems like that's somehow an important thing that we have to think through.
In terms of things in terms of like preparation,
well,
access to advanced courses.
Right. In other words, that there's an awful lot that higher education can change to close those gaps, or at least to help close those gaps. But to the extent that folks are coming out of high school, with large gaps already, obviously it's a much bigger gap to close than if they weren't, if you will. I know that's maybe kind of obvious. I'm just trying to think through how to sort of measure our work and think about, and I guess we'll get into this as you get into the different.
But I think it's a really good point though, Stephen. It makes me think of, how hospitals try to adjust for morbidity levels, right? Because, some of them start with people who are sicker. And so their outcomes by definition are going to be different, even though they strive for them to be better over time. And so I think it's, trying to understand kind of our baseline yet at the same time, recognize that, yes, part of the job actually is, right, to make up for perhaps what has been missed earlier. So, yeah, but I think that's a really good thing for us to keep in mind.
Yeah, thanks.
Mark, I'd like to add to that also is that in K-12, it's important that we start to the data analysis and the analytics that we use to try to better understand. We've been going after the gap head on for quite a long time. We now have the ability to better understand what are some of the root causes of those gaps. And a commission was formed to actually start to look at that. How do we start to impact the culture in which students are learning, the environment in which they're learning, and how do we make sure that that environment is conducive for all of the learners to produce and to be their best? So I think it's going hand in hand with those elements of learning.
Rosa, you raised a great point because I was going to comment about the gaps in K-12. We've known about those for decades, really for a few generations now. And maybe a little bit of progress has been made, but not any substantial progress has been made in closing those achievement gaps, as they call them in K-12. So while it's admirable that we acknowledge what they are, we're really going to have to do something different to make some really measurable change in closing those gaps, because we've known about them for, like I said, for decades. But if we're going to really address that issue, something different is going to have to be done at K-12, because what we've done in the past has worked to some degree, but it hasn't been as effective as we would like it to be.
I would add that I read in an article in the Washington Post last week that there's a $24 billion between one of say white areas and the K through 12 areas and the black and underprivileged areas. $4 billion difference in spending on teachers and facilities, and that is a pretty big chunk that needs to be addressed.
I think much of the conversation now is starting to focus on not just the achievement gap, but the opportunity gap. And Henry, I think that speaks to your comment, the opportunity for students to learn and the opportunities for them to engage in rigorous curricula, the opportunity for them to have health care, the opportunity for them to have all of the prerequisites prior to coming into the pre-K space. How do we start to address that? And so that when they're coming in students who are underprivileged, who are economically disadvantaged. How do we lay the foundation for them to come into that space alongside their peers academically, ready for learning when they come into that space? And that's a big challenge for our Commonwealth and for our nation, and one that we must address.
I really appreciate the discussion. I think we'll continue this tomorrow when we have Dr. Lane with us, the superintendent, to talk on some of these points. If you will, we'll go ahead and get into that first question to continue this conversation, Tom.
Sure. So just to dive into the meat of this toolkit, or these 6 questions that we want to ask ourselves when we are analyzing a potential policy or budget item. First one that we've adapted, again, these were sort of indicators, we've adapted them as questions on our own. First, does the state and institutions frame the success of underserved and underrepresented students as its responsibility? Now, we've got answers and examples for all 6 of these questions, but we just had a little bit of discussion right there. But I'm curious if any council members have any immediate reactions to this idea of the state or our institutions of higher education adopting responsibility for underserved students.
I mean, I'll just say yes at a high level, but it's not necessarily the focus of every choice, right? Or every policy that's been implemented.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I think that's a fair enough response. And I think even in the discussion we just had, oftentimes we do point to environmental factors or other things that are going on, and sometimes that can skirt perhaps some responsibility. But the 2 examples we have is the University of Richmond's commitment to cover the unmet need for all Richmond public school graduates. They are guaranteeing the financial need of graduates of Richmond public schools, and that's them saying that's our responsibility, right? University of Richmond is in our name. We're not going to, just let the cards fall where they may. We are stepping up and taking that responsibility to cover that unmet need. I think an example of maybe where the responsibility is a little bit more in a gray area. Just this past General Assembly session, the General Assembly passed the Enslaved Ancestors College Access Scholarship and Memorial Program, which requires the public institutions that use enslaved labor to build their campuses to create a scholarship to recognize that history. And I think there's just sort of a question when these are all sort of framed as questions for us. Is the state really assuming responsibility if it isn't funding the program? So it's while this is a good example, I think, of the state saying this is our responsibility to recognize this historical legacy. But again, it didn't come with any general fund dollars. So there's a little bit of a question of the responsibility there. I think looking at time, we should go ahead and go to question 2.
Okay. So with that one, as Tom was just presenting, does the state take responsibility? Is the policy that we may be reviewing showing that the state is responsible or going to advance the equity agenda by the policy that we may be looking at? The second one looks at language. Is the language in the policy, is it making assumptions about different groups? Are they reinforcing stereotypes? And I think we've all seen this before, using the word urban, using words that are not clear, grouping populations together versus naming exactly who who the policy is meant to support or address. So coded language. So being sure that we're clear in the policies that we review and that we put out and develop. Some other examples of how important language is. Most recently, the Commission to Examine Racial Inequity in Virginia Law was established by the current governor to look at some of our past laws and the language that was used. And when they were reviewing the education laws, that was some of the most uncomfortable and difficult parts to read because of the language that was included there, because of the things that were sanctioned. But you saw things like the word collegiate, or you would see the word academy used when you were speaking to organizations that were schools for white students. It was normal schools was used when you're talking about Black students or schools for women. Just some of that language. So it's very important in recognizing what stereotypes that they carry along, and so ensuring that we don't reinforce those same stereotypes or lack of clarity in the policies and things that we put forth. Anyone other have examples of language that they've seen that actually was in a policy that actually clouded what was meant, the law was meant to address, whether it's a policy or practice?
This is Ken. I just remember the school that my mother and aunts and uncles all went to in Dinwiddie. The school for the Black students was called Southside Training Center. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That always stuck out with me when they talk about their schooling.
Right, you'll see training or vocational versus academy.
And the elementary school that I attended was called Greensville County Training School. Mm-hmm. Yes. Mm-hmm. So Ken, that means I'm a little bit older than you are.
But language is important, and so that's an important piece that as we review policy, that we ensure that we aren't building in assumptions or using language that is derogatory or offensive. And so that's just another question to ask as we're looking at policy: is this language appropriate?
May I just mention also, I've noted it's a slightly different category, but the Constitution of the Commonwealth talks only about men. It doesn't say persons, doesn't say men and women. It's just, so that also is just sort of outdated in terms of talking about all persons or all people.
That's right. That's right. Thank you.
Excellent. Great examples all around. Our third question, again, that we've adopted is, are data systematically disaggregated by race ethnicity for policy planning and development? And I think perhaps the key word here is systematically, because I think, SCHEV, on just looking at ourselves, I think we do a really good job collecting data and making it available. And more times than not, we give users the option, or we will present disaggregated data by race, ethnicity, but not all the time. And particularly for folks that have spent a lot of time on with our reports or our dashboards, or even our own analysis from the research and planning side of the agency, it's not always consistent. And I think what's going on with this question is the importance of that consistency. But I think we have another good example just from the revisions to the strategic plan, and this is one that really reaches out to me a lot, or speaks to me a lot. So in the previous iteration of the Virginia Plan for Higher Education, we had a handful of goals around closing gaps for underrepresented populations. And that definition of underrepresented populations included non-white U.S. citizens and permanent residents, Pell recipients, so basically low-income students, adults, which is anyone over the age of 25, and residents of localities with low education attainment, which was sort of a proxy for rural areas of Virginia. But when you added all those up, you ended up with about 55% of the students attending four-year public institutions. So by lumping all those groups together, it's really difficult to have a specific conversation that would perhaps define problems and then be able to analyze a budget proposal, a budget item, or a policy proposal with with any sort of specificity for the impact. And this is something I think we should not necessarily be proud of, but this is an example of perhaps SCHEV addressing this question about systematic disaggregation of data. We, in a lot of ways, we've addressed that in the new Virginia plan. So on the left-hand side here, we've got the old plan, 2014, again, that combines low-income rural and non-white students and adult students into one group. Again, that ended up making up over half of all of our students in four-year public institutions. And then the Virginia plan for higher education that we just revisited, I think really is more systematically breaking out race, ethnicity, income, and gender, and geography, and just trying to be a little more specific about closing those gaps and not lumping everyone together. Does the council have any reaction or questions to this? Hearing none, I think we can move on to question number 4, Paula.
I do want to revisit question number 3, if you don't mind, Tom.
Yeah, I actually have a question as well.
And mine's not so much a question. I'll let you go, Chair Connolly, first. You might be saying the same thing.
Oh, no, you first, you first.
I was going to make a comment, not so much a question, but more so just back to the data page, the chart for the Virginia plan, just how this is a kind of question number 3 is a combination of 2 and 3. This is again clarity around language, where in the past we were talking about underrepresented populations, just grouping everyone together and using these proxy terms. I know in the past I've even heard, or I've actually used in the past myself, I'll say, low income, and thinking that we'll capture all of the ethnic minorities under that group as well. But if you aren't clear about what you're trying to identify and measure, you won't be able to have a targeted response either. So if you're trying to just address underrepresented populations like we had in the past, that's over 50% of our students. How specific can our interventions be, or our solutions be, if we aren't breaking down to see, as we talked about earlier, where the problems really are, where the challenges really are, where the inequities really are, where the resources have been diverted and need to be given back. And so I think it's just, again, just want to bring it back up again. That's really language and data in this one, where we have to be really clear. In order for us to have a strong solution, we've got to be really clear with what the challenges are, not use proxy terms, and then have our data support that consistently.
Yep, I think that's spot on. And I mean, we can just think about the different types of needs that, let's say, a low income urban student might have versus a, first time in college rural student, looking for an institution that they can drive to go, right? Completely different set of challenges. But Tom, I know you were put this data out kind of to be illustrative, but I do want to make sure that, and that there's different cuts that would have different overlap, right? Because, if we look at it by socioeconomic status, there's going to be overlap across ethnic groups. But I do want to make sure that we keep students with disabilities front and center. I think, that the chart that shows that being the group that is the least represented, right? I think we need to just embrace, and talk about, as you were saying, Paula, the need to have differentiated strategies, right? Very much so.
Thanks, Roberta. Thanks for bringing that up. All right, we'll move on to question number 4. And this is actually something that Chair Connolly actually talked about already as well. Talking about the disproportionate impact, some unintentional consequences of policies. Like oftentimes we're thinking we're coming up with the right answer. And if you aren't disaggregating your data, you think you might be, and then you realize you're still hurting the population that you thought you were helping. And so that happens quite often. I've heard, we were talking jokingly about fixing a pipe where you fix it in one place and then the leak comes out somewhere else. And so it really has to be, you have to be thoughtful about coming up with policy and making sure that you're not negatively impacting other populations and disproportionately impacting other groups. And so an example of that we've done, go ahead, Tom, to the next one. We think about this a lot with our funding. We think we're providing funding to schools, and then we realize if we're based on FTE, oftentimes we're hurting the schools that serve our most vulnerable populations the most. We're thinking about schools, oftentimes ethnic minority students, low-income students also oftentimes go part-time because they're working. They're also our most vulnerable students. And so giving those schools less money to support the schools that have the students that have the greatest need doesn't really make sense, although it sounded right in the beginning. There's an unintentional impact. And so just being very clear about, being very cautious about the impact, thinking out things, and lots of times what helps with that is having a diverse number of people at the table. So everyone's kind of thinking about it from different perspectives. So that's where diversity becomes kind of a key factor in developing policy, to ensure that you're looking at the various perspectives and the different populations that you may be impacting with what you think might be a good decision. Any other thoughts about, where you have seen in the past a policy that had good intentions but also ended up having some hurtful impact?
I mean, I think in general, I haven't looked at the data on this by race or ethnicity, but I think in general, the United States and Virginia as well tend to place the lion's share of our higher education commitments on four-year colleges and universities that tend to have students that are better academically prepared and wealthier than those kids who attend, not just kids and adults who attend community colleges. Be one example from my perspective. In other words, the folks that need the most help in general are the least funded, at least from an institutional support perspective at the state level. And that's true of other states as well.
That's a good point. Any other discussion? Okay, ready for number 5.
Okay, our 5th question, are the needs of students from racial, ethnic, and indigenous communities consistently included in the policy? And I think, we have a few examples, recent examples of SCHEV doing this, and the answer being yes, and the answer also, and then some other examples of the answer being less clear. So first, in SCHEV's budget and policy recommendations this past November, while we had our broad budget recommendations to the governor, that did focus a good amount on the money that was unallotted the previous April due to the COVID pandemic. We also made sure we tiered our recommendations further in order to prioritize the most vulnerable students. So when we were deciding which asks, I guess, that should rise to the top, just as a unit, and also as a committee, and the council at large, supported these budget and policy items that would help the vulnerable students the most. And perhaps an example where we fall a little bit short on this question that immediately comes to mind, whether we're thinking about these different communities, is Virginia's statewide policy on broadband. It's one that largely focuses on rural infrastructure. And that is very important because we do know that, there are many areas in the Commonwealth that do not have fiber optic cable infrastructure so a company can sell a subscription service of broadband internet. But the research that SCHEV and others have produced is that some of the widest gaps of the digital divide in Virginia are actually more around computer ownership. So the gaps between the statewide average and having broadband in the home are actually a little bit narrower than the gaps that we see in computer ownership. Now, right now, I'm talking about African American and Latino households against the average, but I think we also, care about the other comparisons too. But I think that this is one example where perhaps, again, our state policy is largely focused on infrastructure, which is important, but doesn't necessarily address the affordability issue, both of computers and of the affordability of the subscription service that might impact African American and Latino students more.
Hey, it's March. Just a quick comment. This is a little bit to this point, but also to the previous point. I was continuing to think about kind of our current policies, and I guess, I believe that we might find that even the current funding strategy associated with the way we calculate base adequacy would be one of those policies that, doesn't really, right? Because it doesn't look at who the institutions are serving as much as it looks at the programmatic content, that's being delivered. And so, I wonder if there's an opportunity for us to rethink that a bit.
Madam Chair, I think that's a great point. I think I would have had a lot of trouble to summarize that in a sub bullet. How our funding strategies may not be incorporating the needs of different students, but you're absolutely right. Right now, we measure a lot of inputs, and we do sort of treat all students the same. And we know they are coming from different places, and I look forward to the cost study we'll be conducting over the next 12 to 18 months. So I think that's definitely something we'll want to follow back up on and keep you updated on.
I just wanted to maybe add also, or ask the question that this sort of assumes that rural broadband infrastructure is all about education. And I think it's important to add that education is a component of that. It obviously does a lot of other things as well. So I think we have to talk about how to impact issues that are outside of necessarily our influence, but still affect education, both K through 12 and higher ed. I think pinning all of it on this is a little bit interesting as a choice. I see it as a good choice in terms of the cause for discussion, but it's not entirely an education funding initiative.
I wanted to add one thought to the last point, and that is we also need to be thinking in terms of how funding runs when there are cuts. When the economy goes down and all of a sudden there's a 5% cut, often those are across the board, but they impact certain students more than others. And I'm not sure that's looked at that way, and probably needs to be.
Absolutely.
I think, Mr. Lay, I think the quote I heard over the past year is, we're all in the same storm, but we're different sized boats. So just doing anything across the board really impacts different organizations differently based upon their current circumstances. And so I think that was a great way to segment for us to go on to the next one, equity framing, how we frame our discussions and our policies. Are we framing our policies in a way that appeal to the largest number of people and their interests? Are we talking about economic well-being, demographic shifts, and/or the moral imperative? How do we describe the reason why we're making these changes or efforts? Are we appealing to the largest number of people, and are we addressing all three in how we present our information and make our arguments? And I think we've got a couple examples on the next slide, which speak to CNBC said Virginia is the best state for business. That's obviously appealing to the economic conversation as it relates to equity in education. But the G3 program, on the other hand, has really done a really great job of kind of speaking to a variety of ways, the interests of a variety of groups. Not only is it speaking to the economic interest in terms of the high demand jobs, but also the value to society with those jobs and what that will do to uplift different members of society and make this a much more equitable state. And so there are ways that we can always think about as we present our information, as we review our policies to ensure that we are appealing to as many people as possible to get their buy-in and their support. The conversation we just had a moment ago talking about broadband, we are looking at obviously from an education perspective, but it is part of a larger conversation. And so being sure that we are including everyone and as many people as possible in the information that we put out. Those are our 6. I think, Tom, you're going to talk a little bit about how you see us moving forward in applying these questions. And then I'd like to kind of go over and reflect and review them a bit.
Hey, Paula, can I just make a quick point about the earlier slide?
Of course.
The one with CNBC. I just want to make this point because it comes up occasionally. I think what a lot of people don't realize about the CNBC ranking of best states for business is that Virginia does, the reason that we rank number 1 as the best state for business is principally because of the people-related factors. We rank number 1 in the country for education, number 1 for workforce. We have relatively low poverty, relatively high health insurance coverage, and so forth. Those are the things that really, in particular, the education and workforce-related things and educational attainment things that really got us to the top. The actual business-related factors were above average, but not exceptional in that regard. So it's actually been one of the good stories, I think, about this particular rankings. It really reflects how attractive Virginia is for people in general, not just for companies. I just had to make that point because it relates to my work. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. See, that's the whole thing about having different people at the table. You get different perspectives. It's important. Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Murray, I think you actually almost kind of, made our point. I feel like they are inextricable in many ways. You can't be the best state for business without being the best state for education, and so that matters a lot. And I think it's one that we're proud to show, and it's one that I don't think we're going to lose that justification or that narrative anytime soon, at least in terms of the how related education and business are. I don't need to spend too much time on this slide. I don't think this slide was actually originally in the beginning of our presentation, just to show some concrete examples of how SCHEV staff are thinking about applying these 6 questions. So here are just sort of a series of situations that happen in SCHEV staff and in council members' day-to-day work. These are the opportunities for us to incorporate that equity-based policy analysis. So, earlier I mentioned the SCHEV's policy and budget recommendations. I mean, this is essentially SCHEV's position on what, or sort of opening argument for what the higher education budget should look like. So, I think we have opportunities to incorporate these 6 questions when we make those recommendations. Our academic affairs unit in their program approvals work, but also in transfer policy and dual enrollment policy, there are opportunities here to ask and incorporate equity-based policy analysis. We went over the Virginia Plan for Higher Education. We had a few examples of that. But, SCHEV as an agency, we also have discretionary choices throughout the year. Sometimes these sort of one-time funds, just federal stimulus, and us working with the governor's office on the governor's discretionary funds. How do we advance equity there? We also have the Fund for Excellence and Innovation. We can take applications and we can use equity-based criteria and ask these questions in making those decisions. Very directly, and this is a little bit of inside baseball, just for what SCHEV does. And our staff is the legislative action summaries, which is just requests that we get from the governor's office to analyze proposed pieces of legislation in the General Assembly. This is one where I think actually inspired us to try to be a little bit more systematic in our policy analysis because, just notice that sometimes these analyses of bills can vary depending on the staff member assigned to conduct that LAS. But and also dependent on time and whether it's a new bill or not, and the like. But even though these aren't public, these in many ways end up sort of being like talking points documents almost for SCHEV's position on pieces of legislation during the General Assembly session. A bill will come up. How does SCHEV feel about this? The first place we look is the LAS. So definitely opportunities there to incorporate these 6 questions. And then fiscal impact statement is similar. Department of Planning and Budget are the folks that are more involved there, but we're often requested to help as well.
I have a question on this one.
Sure.
I think I feel like I should know the answer to this and I don't. But on the legislative action summaries, are we required to provide an impact statement in terms of populations?
That is an excellent question, Siriaga. I believe there is a section in the LAS template, which does change from time to time, right? It's often up to each governor's administration to determine what that template looks like. I believe it is, the language is somewhere along the line of impact on selected populations, but it's not specific on whether we need to disaggregate or whether we need to be specific about gender, race, ethnicity, economic status, et cetera. So I think you could run, and again, I mean, as someone, Peter can probably correct me as well on the exact language, but I think broadly, an individual staff member could interpret that section as, okay, here is my opportunity to analyze this through an equity lens. But I think we also identified it as something we'd like to work with the governor's office more to either get more specific or perhaps even get more in depth on what that disproportionate impact would be.
If I could just add to that, I think in this past year, we did share these 6 questions and these indicators with staff who often do the LAS forms. So for this past General Assembly. And so what Beverly Rebar did was type in these questions into our template so that as we were filling out the form, even though it may not have been a specific question in the LAS form, we were kind of prompting ourselves to remember, maybe look at it from this angle. Will there be disproportionate impact? Will this impact the equity agenda? And so we put these 6 questions into our template so that our responses would speak to those issues, even though the question might not exactly ask for that. And lots of times we would respond. I mean, I think there were some responses saying that the data was not disaggregated, so you really couldn't speak as to whether it would address the issues or not.
And as you do that, I would just say, and have in front of you that very first graph that you did in demographics that started with disabilities under 50% and and the populations that went after that. I'm just thinking about at the federal level in the USAID, for example, having policies when they really want to integrate something, they've requested impact statements on that issue, whether it's gender integration or disabilities or any other priority that they're institutionalizing.
Absolutely. And we've actually seen where some states have now included equity impact statements. Just like you had the fiscal impact statement, there's a separate statement on equity.
Great.
Paula and Tom, this is Katie. I have to think about this a little bit more, but I know for the Planning and Resources Committee today, we're going to begin the discussion of the 6-year planning process and the template for that. And I wonder whether some of the questions that you all have raised might be ones we want to have as part of our discussion in preparation for the 6-year planning process. Because we're all in this together, and what the institutions are doing might affect what we might be doing, and we might be able to figure out a way to make it a meaningful activity for both SCHEV and all the institutions. So anyway, it's just a thought that I need to think about some more too.
That's a great, Katie, Ms. Webb. I think, and that's part of the reason why we wanted to share these questions, so we can start thinking about how we can implement them throughout the work that we do. You know, whether it's SCHEV agency staff or council members, just how can we thoughtfully include this type of analysis in all the work that we do? Because indeed, equity impacts everyone, and it's good for everyone. And so how can we make sure that we are applying this equitably?
Could you show us the slide again on the 6 questions?
Sure. Let's actually, here we go. So these are the original indicators that we have reframed as questions.
I guess the first one, does the state take does the state take responsibility? Is appropriate language being used? Is it clear? Is data disaggregated? Are there disproportionate impacts from the policy? Is it consistent from beginning to end from in terms of the needs and things identified, matching up with the outcomes and the planned interventions? And then is it framed to appeal to a large group of people? And so if you, I think it's a great way to think about it. It really is the strategic plan on higher ed. If you walk through this, I think the way it's been updated this year really does reflect on these questions being asked. It really does reflect, and hopefully will turn out to have more equitable outcomes from that plan as we develop different activities and strategies to support the goals. But Mr. Light, did you have a question specifically about one of the 6?
No, I think those are excellent points, though, that we can sort of use to help guide our thinking as we go through the issues our various committees go through. And it's a nice, I was just trying to think if there was anything I could think of that was not on there, and I can't think of anything that's not on there that would help guide our thinking in this regard. That's very well done.
Well, I really appreciate you saying that, because that's the thing we do. This is not the end all be all for this presentation or these thoughts. We do want to continue to tweak this presentation. So as we share it with others, as we do our work in the office, that we are able to really think more comprehensively about this work to ensure that we do have more equitable outcomes from the work that we do. And so if you have other thoughts, other questions that we should be asking, other better examples or additional examples that we can use to really drive home what we're trying to present, or the indicators, we really would appreciate those thoughts. We want to make this better and stronger and make it easier for people to understand.
Marge, I have a couple thoughts when you have a minute.
Please go ahead.
I just wanted to offer kind of 2 thoughts about, you know, where we go from here, at least from my perspective. One is, I know we didn't maybe hit on this exactly today, and I can't say I've looked at this data specifically for Virginia, but I'm fairly confident that once we, and to some extent, Tom, I think actually did hit on this, but when we think about our goal to become the best educated state in the country, the only plausible way for us to get there is to have greater success with first generation college students, as well as underrepresented groups, the various groups we've been talking about today. So there really is kind of a really complementary, I think, aspect that this equity lens takes on relative to a longstanding goal of SCHEV. And then I think secondly, and maybe more importantly, there's a tremendous amount of really well done literature on, you know, what causes the gaps that are there, or what contributes at least to the gaps that are there at, you know, at every stage from pre-K all the way through completion at the college level. I'd love for us to be able to find ways to make use of that, and perhaps not only within SCHEV, but in partnering with our partners K through 12 and pre-K through 12 to really put together a plan, a set of strategies for how we would actually move the needle, you know, on closing the gaps in a meaningful way. And I know that's already, I'm sure that's already very much what this team is, the staff and others and you are thinking about. But I do think there's just a lot that we can learn from. That's great work that's already been done, a lot of it national, but very applicable to Virginia, and that we could perhaps work on together and help, you know, our administration leaders, General Assembly leaders, and the business community to really understand better what the factors are that contribute to these gaps, and what the research suggests are some of the strongest levers we could pull to help close those gaps. Because if we can really make progress, it not only helps us to achieve that goal of becoming the best educated state, but we'd have, we would experience more economic mobility. We'd have better, workforce availability for businesses, better opportunities for individuals to advance their own economic conditions and so forth. So I'm kind of excited about where we are and the potential for this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. I think you actually closed this out very well and summed up the purpose of it all. And you did it in a great framing. You kind of touched on all three of those economics and moral values and demographic shifts. So I think you summed it up really well. So thank you for that. We are hoping that we can apply this, and I think you'll hear a lot tomorrow when Mr. Lane's remarks about some of the things that we are doing that we'll be and hopefully doing collaboratively moving forward to really address these needs and close some gaps. So I'll turn it over to the chair. Thanks, everyone.
Okay. Well, thank you. That was great, guys. I really do appreciate it. And I do think that this is going to be helpful and something that we revisit. I actually do have one request, which is maybe to take those questions, put them on a single piece of paper, and send those out to the council so that it's something that we literally can have in front of us, right, when we have some of our discussions, because I think continuing to refer back is going to be something that's very valuable. All right, then we'll close out this particular session. And in about 5 minutes, we'll reconvene both the Academic Affairs Committee as well as the, you know what, I messed up. I forgot to read something in the beginning. My apologies. I'm going to read it now before we close, which is due to the pandemic, we are able to conduct SCHEV business remotely without a quorum assembled. This meeting is being recorded as required by 2020 Acts of Assembly, Chapter 1283, Item 4.0.01.g. A copy of the recording will be posted on the SCHEV website. So my apologies for the lateness in reading that, but that will carry us through for the committee meetings as well. So with that, we'll say goodbye to this one. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.